Welcome to the Korea Now podcast. I'm Jed Lea-Henry, your host, and on today's episode we'll be talking to Blaine Harden, author of 3 books on North Korea, and we'll be working through all 3 of them with him. Without any further delay, this is Blaine Harden. Today on the Korea Now podcast we have Blaine Harden, author of numerous books. His most recent few have been Escape from Camp 14, The Great Leader and the Fighter Pilot, and his latest book, King of Spies. He has a 30-year career as a journalist with the Washington Post, including the New York Times and Time magazine, and has in fact visited North Korea with the New York Philharmonic. Blaine Harden, welcome to the Korea Now podcast.
Thank you. Good to be here.
So I might start with your second book first, actually, The Great Leader and the Fighter Pilot. A story where you combine the 2 lives of Kim Il-sung and a young MiG pilot, Kum-sok, now Kenneth Rowe. So in the early years of the North Korean state, you run through the life of Kim Il-sung, and I might get you just to play out a little bit of his life here, because he's quite an impressive guy, at least compared to his son and his grandson.
Well, it's true. The thing about Kim Il-sung that was interesting to me when I was doing the research is that he was really quite famous when he was young. He'd become a kind of folk hero in Japanese-occupied Korea. And that's because he had managed to strike against the Japanese colonial police in Manchuria, and he slipped over the border a couple times and did the same thing in northern Korea at the time. He did not significantly damage the Japanese power structure, but he killed some Japanese policemen, and he got his name on a list of the most wanted but from the Japanese colonial government. And it was assumed among a lot of Koreans on the peninsula at the time that he was an older man than he was, a more experienced man. And then when he turned up in Soviet-occupied North Korea in his early 30s, and people saw him for the first time, they were incredulous. They didn't believe that this was the real Kim Il-sung. They thought he was an older and more distinguished man. In fact, when he appeared in front of an audience in Pyongyang in the mid 1940s, people shouted at him saying that you're the fake Kim Il-sung.
Yes. Yes. So if I might get this just to play through the life of No Kum-sok now. So they're quite diverse people, these two. And No Kum-sok was a young MiG pilot who the story is based around, and they have completely different life stories.
Right. No Kum-sok was born, he's the son of a baseball playing executive who worked for a Japanese controlled conglomerate, and he helped run the railroads for this Japanese company. No Kum-sok's father did. And his father played baseball. He liked the United States. He really hated Japanese fascism, but he also hated Soviet communism. And he showed his son, No, books about the United States when the boy was young and impressionable. And when No Kum-sok's father died, when the boy was about 14 or 15, the boy was really cast adrift because Kim Il-sung was rising to power. The writing was on the wall that North Korea was going to become a tough communist state to live in. And so No had to figure out a way to survive. And what he decided to do was to pretend to be a communist, pretend to be a fervent supporter of Kim Il-sung. And he hoped by doing so that he could find an escape hatch. He originally thought that he would join the Navy and get on a Navy vessel of some sort and find his way out of North Korea that way. Then he had a chance to volunteer to join the emerging North Korean Air Force, which he did. And at the age of, I think it was 18, he became the youngest fighter pilot in the North Korean Air Force. And this was just as the Korean War was starting. And Stalin had sent some of his best pilots to Manchuria to train Chinese and North Korean pilots how to fly the MiG, which was the hottest fighter jet in the world at the time. And Kum-sok found himself being trained by Russian fighter pilots to fight against the Americans. He, of course, embraced the MiG as the speediest escape vehicle possible. And finally, he did use that MiG in September of 1953. This is after the war, after he'd flown about 150 missions against the Americans during the war. He used that MiG to fly from Pyongyang to near Seoul, where he landed and turned over the MiG and asked for asylum, and was soon in the United States going to college. And he spent the rest of his life living and working in the United States as an aerospace engineer.
Well, I might get you to go through that landing that he went through there, because it's quite a remarkable story. He lands at Gimpo Airport, come the wrong way down the runway. He's lucky enough to be coming down on a day when the radar is down for repairs, and he's lucky enough not to be shot out of the sky and not shot when he lands as well.
He was incredibly lucky. He had waited for years to make his escape. He thought about doing it during the war, but he really didn't have the right situation. So he took off on a training flight from Pyongyang in September, I think it was September 23rd, 1953. And he went up by himself on this training flight with nobody flying. He wasn't a wingman for anyone, or no one was flying with him, which was what he wanted. Unbeknownst to him, the Americans that morning had turned off the radar at Gimpo for routine repair. The war was over. American fighter jets were out training that day from the base, but there was no radar monitoring flights coming from the north. And it was a very clear day, and No could see the airport very well. And the way he came in with the wind. And all the other aircraft landing that day, other jets, American Sabre jets, F-86, were landing against the wind, as these fighter jets do, because it's safer. So No managed to land at exactly the same time that an F-86 flown by an American was landing in the opposite direction. They hit the runway about the same time. And they saw each other, and they managed to move aside enough so that they didn't have a head-on collision. And he pulled his MiG off to the side of the runway and found some Americans who were waiting to fly in their F-86s. And he jumped out of his MiG and started shaking hands.
And when he gets out of this plane, he tears up the picture of Kim Il-sung. And it's quite a poignant moment, because you mentioned it just previously. His life in North Korea, as most people's lives in North Korea, is this something he has to hide from everyone else. So he pretended to be a fantastic communist and a fantastic follower of the regime.
Right. He in his aircraft, as in all of the aircraft, as in virtually every room in North Korea at that time and until this day, there was a picture of somebody from the Kim family, in this case, Kim Il-sung. So he jumped out of the plane, took the photograph, ripped it. There was a little photograph, ripped it out of its frame, and then ripped it up. Some American fighter pilots saw him do it, and they thought that he was ripping up a photograph of his sweetheart, who he would never see again because he had fled the country. That was a story that first went out over the Associated Press that day. But in fact, he ripped up the picture of Kim Il-sung because he really hated the guy. And this landing was the sort of culmination of years of deceit and planning on his part to escape his clutches. So he felt he had to rip up that photograph as the final act of his escape.
Yes. So I might go back to Kim Il-sung for a second here, and the start of the Korean War rather than the end. You have this quote there where you said he was a genius for a day. Genius for a month during the Korean War. Well,
Kim Il-sung struggled to get Stalin's support for this war, which he needed. He needed Stalin's equipment. Basically, that's what he really needed was arms, tanks, artillery, air support, and technical advisors. It took Kim Il-sung, he had to make 3 trips to visit, 3 secret trips to Moscow to persuade Stalin that this invasion of the South would be a good idea and that the Americans would not fight back. There are now transcripts of the conversations between Kim Il-sung and Stalin during those meetings. And in those meetings, Kim Il-sung told Stalin that the Americans would not fight back and that the North Korean forces would win within a couple days. And Stalin was very reluctant to believe this story. But over time, Stalin seemed to have become convinced that this invasion would cost the Americans a lot in terms of blood and treasure to reverse. And Stalin was, I think, a little surprised by the quickness of the Americans in responding. And then finally, in the overwhelming firepower that the Americans brought to bear to reverse the invasion. But still, Stalin was pretty happy with the way the war went because he did not lose very much other than some arms and material. Very few Soviet fighter pilots were killed in the war. Stalin did not send in any troops. And he says in the conversations with Kim Il-sung that the war is going well and the loss of hundreds of thousands of lives of the Koreans, and millions actually, that was something that, it's not much of a price to pay for the advance of worldwide communism. And so the Korean War really didn't have a chance of ending until Stalin died in the spring of 1953. And when Stalin died, then there was nobody else who really wanted this war to continue. And all the sides very quickly began negotiating a peace.
Yes, so on that point, you mentioned, and it's quite right, that so for most of the war, the Soviets fought from the sky, and then the Chinese fought from the ground. The North Koreans were, or at least Kim Il-sung, was sidelined for a long period there. But you also mentioned Brian Myers here, and it's worth mentioning that you do quote here that he believes that Juche, the idea of independence, or at least that's what they believe it is, self-determination, self-dependence, is meaningless, at least as an ideology. And you mentioned numerous times in the book how the war, how they relied on their 2 communist big brothers to fight most of the war for them.
Well, it's true. The concept of Juche, of self-reliance, is there's just so much historical fact that renders that concept to be ridiculous. The war itself would have been impossible without the support of the Soviet Union. North Korea would have ceased to exist. In fact, it did cease to exist after the Americans marched all the way up to the Yalu River during the first year of the war. And only with the intervention of China and the takeover of the war, the complete takeover of the war by Chinese forces, was North Korea reconstituted, and Kim Il-sung had a nation to lead after he emerged from his bunker. And then in the rebuilding of North Korea over the next 3 decades after the war, the resources, the capital, the expertise, the industrial knowledge that helped North Korea actually rebuild in a rather remarkable way, that was from, massive gifts from the Soviet Union, but mostly from China, actually, and also from the East Bloc countries like Poland, Hungary, Bulgaria. All of those, North Korea really was a beggar state throughout that era.
Yeah, so on that rebuilding, they were quite successful in the early years, and they had to be, because as you mentioned a few times that at least on estimates, 20% of all North Koreans were killed by American bombing, and 85% of all infrastructure was razed. And in fact, Kenneth Rowe was in Chongqing and watched as the city was flattened around him at one point. And you quote here, "Every North Korean has a grandfather who was killed by a US bomb."
that's one of the things that really struck me from researching this book, was the severity, the ubiquity of the bombing by the Americans throughout the war, almost from the beginning to the end. The one thing that's the Americans were caught with their pants down by this invasion from the north. There were only 500 American troops in South Korea when the invasion occurred. The Americans had withdrawn heavy artillery, tanks, and the South Korean forces, some of whom fought rather well. They simply didn't have the kind of equipment needed to stop Soviet tanks and very well-trained North Korean forces. So what happened was that the North could do what it wanted until the Americans could fight back. And the one way that they could fight back more quickly than any other way was to bring in bombers that had been used in World War II over Japan and over Europe. And the Americans had plenty of these big aircraft. They had plenty of bomber pilots. They had an unlimited amount of conventional explosives for making bombs. And they were also making lots and lots of napalm. And the Americans sort of systematically went to work destroying all of the cities and towns of North Korea. And in some cases, they would burn the towns or blow up the towns with conventional weapons and then burn the rubble with napalm. And it went on for 3 years.
So how do you see this bombing? People like Bruce Cummins believes it's close to being a war crime. Do you think it's anything serious, or do you think it's people like LeMay and MacArthur simply running over the same ideology that they ran through during the World War II, a few years earlier?
Well, what I think was that the Americans they felt that they had the moral high ground because they didn't start the war, and there was massive suffering and death caused by the North Korean invasion. But the Americans had these weapons, and they were virtually unopposed in the air, except for the fighter pilots that fought in Mig Alley, this little strip of land between Manchuria and North Korea, which was a relatively small area. All the rest of North Korea was like a happy hunting ground for American bombers. They could fly over there, drop their bombs, and then fly home and have dinner with almost no risk of being shot down. And as Kum-sok explained when he watched the bombing of a city, the Americans just sort of casually came in and bombed every stretch of that city. It was like mowing a lawn, how systematically they did it. And that's the way they destroyed all of the cities. Now, the utility of that bombing is questionable. It certainly caused a lot of suffering in North Korea, but did it change the result of the war? Did it force China to stop fighting because they took over the war in the first year? And the answer is not really. So the Americans were killing large numbers of civilians to no real war end. And there's a lot of analysis now to suggest that the Americans learned the wrong lesson from the Korean War, a lesson that they then applied in Vietnam to the same rather useless end. You can bomb and bomb and bomb and bomb, and it doesn't win the war.
But some of that lesson was learnt by North Korea, at least in terms of their Songun ideology or military first ideology. And you mentioned at some point which is soon going to happen again after the Olympics are finished, the war games that America and South Korea hold together. And you mentioned how both the history of the Korean War and these war games, these annual war games, play into an idea of a North Korea whose general citizenry are actually really scared daily of North Korean. Sorry.
Right. So there is a fact-based narrative that the Kim family dictatorship can remind the population of, is that the Americans did come with bombs and fire and death. And they destroyed virtually every population center in North Korea. And they killed almost every North Korean now living in that country has a relative who was injured or killed by the American bombing, a grandfather or a great uncle or something. So if the Kim family reminds the population of what the Americans did, and then the American president, whoever it is, whether it's Donald Trump or Obama or George Bush, if they fly a B-52 or a stealth bomber over the peninsula, that feeds into this narrative that the Kims have been so successful in marketing to their people, which is, we protected you against the Americans the last time, and we'll do it again. And as you can see from these overflights, the Americans are still in the business of flying these aircraft over our peninsula and still threatening us with, bombs and fire and death. And the only way you can be protected is to support us. And, there's a significant amount of buy-in, I think, from the population of North Korea, in part because, they don't have all that many other sources of information, but also because there's a truth to the story that they're telling. Dictatorships rule by a combination of repression, information control, but they also need a profound existential threat to protect their people from, or to persuade their people that they're protecting them from that threat. And that's what the Americans continue to provide to the Kim regime.
So on that point, are you more of a fan of the Obama era strategic patience, or you believe that a stronger sand in the line sort of idea, whether it's Trump or not, is more appropriate?
Well, a strategic patience did not prevent the Kim regime from developing, more bombs and more delivery systems. And I'm not sure that fish-shaking threats from the Trump administration have stopped the development of bombs and delivery systems either. It's a very difficult problem dealing with the longest-lasting totalitarian system in world history. The Kims are good at what they do based on their survival record. They've lasted more than twice as long as any other state with that system of government. And it's hard to know exactly what to do. I don't pretend to have any solution that hasn't been thought of by other people. But I think what I try to do in the books that I've written about North and South Korea is to explain to Americans where the problem came from. And part of that understanding is to explain to Americans that the Korean Peninsula was divided by the United States. This problem from hell that won't go away was basically created by a decision made in the 1940s under Harry Truman, and that we're living with the consequences of that rather stupid decision to this day. We have lots of skin in this game, both from the war and from helping to create the circumstances that caused the war. And I think it gives us a bit of humility in trying to understand the dimensions of the problem. That's been the purpose of the books that I've written.
So Kenneth Rowe takes off in his MiG-15 and lands in Kimpo Air Base. And
Right.
He meets almost immediately Donald Nichols, which leads us into your most recent book, King of Spies.
Yes.
So you've described Donald Nichols at one point as the Korean Lawrence of Arabia. Yeah.
He's both, I think he's, in some ways, he was Lawrence of Arabia, and in some ways he's Colonel Kurtz from Heart of Darkness.
Yeah.
Donald Nichols was this is his background. He was born in New Jersey, the youngest of four boys in a really troubled family. His mother, when Donald was a young boy in the family living room, his mother would bathe naked in the kitchen sink and have sex with men, not her husband, on the family sofa in front of the boys. So And then a couple of years later, his mother just up and left the family. And his father, a postman, was heartbroken by the departure of his beloved wife. And so he took the 4 boys and he moved to South Florida into the teeth of the Depression in the 1930s, where they were miserably poor. And Donald, between the ages of 5 and 17, he became sort of a hustler kid. He would steal tomatoes and tractor parts from the neighbors. He worked stealing food from restaurants. He was sort of a jack of all trades, and what he tried to do was to bring home enough food and money to help feed his brothers and his father. He was a miserably unhappy child with holes in his pants and no underwear, and he rarely bathed. When he was 17 years old, he joined the army, mostly so he could have enough money to eat and send home to his father. So he joined the army, served in World War II in Karachi, where he learned that if he was good at fiddling with paperwork, he could get promotions and please his bosses, the officers for whom he worked in the U.S. Army. So he was promoted from buck private to master sergeant in 2 years. Normally it takes 10 to 15 years to get that kind of promotion in the U.S. Army. Nichols had a genius for playing games that would make his officers happy and give him power. After World War II ended, he went home briefly, and then he was sent to Guam, where he joined an army spying corps, and then was sent to Korea in 1946. And he arrived in Korea at a time when the peninsula had just been divided. Very few American military intelligence people were there, and very few military personnel wanted to be in Korea. It was said, the famous line is that if you lived in Japan as a military, as a soldier, as a GI or an officer, there were 3 things you feared: gonorrhea, diarrhea, and being posted to Korea. But Donald Nichols didn't feel that way. He went to Korea and he saw opportunity. He became a very close collaborator with Sigmund Rhee, as Sigmund Rhee was consolidating power and becoming president of South Korea. And their relationship between Donald Nichols, who was only 21 years old when he met Sigmund Rhee by that time was 70, they found favor in each other's eyes. They scratched each other's backs, shared information, and Donald Nichols became a ill-educated but supremely powerful young intelligence operative before, during, and after the Korean War.
So how did that come about? It's a 21-year-old grade school dropout. He apparently only finished 7th grade, and he's had 3 months spy training. And he goes to South Korea, and he almost immediately becomes close friends with the most powerful and most well-educated Korean in the country.
It's amazing that it came about, and how they happened to meet, I don't know. I don't know where they met, but I do know that they met in the summer and fall of 1946. This was about a year after Sigmund Rhee had come back, and he was consolidating power using the Japanese-trained Korean police to suppress his political rivals in what would soon turn out to be a very bloody civil war in South Korea. And Nichols basically joined up on Rhee's side in that civil war. And I found lots of paperwork showing that Nichols was close to Rhee, that Rhee actually requested in writing, in letters to the American ambassador to South Korea, that Nichols be allowed to work for Rhee as his special advisor in the creation of an air force. And Nichols did that. And lo and behold, the South Koreans did create an air force against the official desires of the U.S. military. So Nichols was sort of working on both sides of the street, gathering information from the South Koreans about what was going on in South Korea and in North Korea, and at the same time delivering information to Sigmund Rhee about what his commanders thought of Sigmund Rhee.
So as you said there, he had quite amazing foresight to convince the South Koreans to build a military just before the Korean War, but he also had a tremendous record before that as well. He apparently he gave the earliest warnings of the Korean War, or at least the build-up of the North Korean side, and it was largely ignored by Willoughby and MacArthur.
Right. Nichols was very well sourced through Sigmund Rhee. Sigmund Rhee would give to Nichols all of the intelligence available to the South Koreans, who had, the country was the DMZ was not at such a formidable line at that point, the border between the two countries, and South Korea had lots of spying resources in the north. They would write up their reports and send the people who were writing those reports to Nichols, and Nichols would rewrite them and then send them to his superiors in the Air Force and in Tokyo. Nichols was one of several American intelligence operatives who were raising flags saying the North Koreans are preparing to invade. But Nichols he was a good writer in the sense that he could spot a trend and then write a report that was clear and precise. And one of his reports found its way to Washington and alarmed the State Department and the head of the Air Force, and they sent a message back to MacArthur and his chief of intelligence, Willoughby, saying, is Nichols right? Are they planning to invade? And Willoughby's response to that was to try to get Nichols fired. I found previously classified documents showing that Willoughby tried to get the U.S. ambassador to throw Nichols out of Korea, not because he was wrong, but because the information that he was presenting to the Americans was upsetting the great General MacArthur.
He eventually overcomes a lot of these problems with Washington, and during the Korean War, he was tremendously effective, fighting out of the Busan perimeter, breaking North Korean codes, and at one point he becomes so effective running his war that he's effectively left by himself to run it as he wishes.
That's right. Nichols was this complex man who didn't seem to have any real moral bearings, any real values. He was quite content to push people out of aircraft to their death, to sit in on torture. He attended a number of mass killings in the Civil War in South Korea and never reported what he saw to his superiors. So that was sort of the dark side of him. But on the other side, he was brave. He was resourceful, and he really helped the Americans so they did not lose the war in the first crucial months when the Americans were on the run, when they were pushed all the way back down into the Pusan perimeter, and they really looked like they might be pushed off the Korean peninsula altogether. He had the foresight to gather a group of cryptographers, North Korean cryptographers, who he got into the South Korean Air Force, and their code break operations helped the Americans to withstand attacks on the perimeter and then overcome the North Korean army in that part of the war. He really was a war hero, and he deserved he was given the Silver Star and the Distinguished Service Cross and about 20 other medals, and he really earned them. And he, besides being a war hero and being, cagey in at times of battle and never being afraid, he was also very good at figuring out ways to enhance his own power. So he created, with the help of the Air Force general who was in charge of all of the Korean operations, General Partridge, Earl Partridge, he created this command structure where he was by this time he was a captain and then a major. He reported exclusively to the general in charge of the air war for Korea. And no one else could tell him what to do. And General Partridge gave Nichols his own base, his own private army of spies, which numbered around 1,000 to 1,200. mostly Koreans, and his own rules. I found letters in which Partridge said, basically, you know, I can't tell you how to do it. You're the master spy in charge. And Nichols said he was given a license to murder, and he used it.
He had a degree of amorality about him, and at some point you mentioned that he's the sort of person you want on your side during war, and immediately afterwards you don't want him anymore. You want to lock him up. And he has quite a dramatic post-war decline, doesn't he?
His post-war decline was something that I had not heard of when I started working on the book. I had heard about Nichols only because Kum-sok had met him when he defected. He was the person who debriefed him. But after the war was over, Nichols didn't go home like most soldiers and spies do. He stayed on for another 4 years. And in 1957, Nichols maintained his close relationship with Sigmund Rhee. In fact, Nichols was close friend with some of Sigmund Rhee's henchmen who were responsible for killing a large number of people. In any case, in 1957, the Americans decided that Nichols had stayed too long at the fair, so to speak. They took away his command. They took away his base. They took away his private fleet of boats that he'd used to take spies into North Korea. And they told him that he had to go home. And Nichols was very depressed by this. And at some point, the Americans came for him in the middle of the night, put him in a straitjacket, and secretly took him to a psychiatric hospital in Japan, where they pumped him full of Thorazine. And then when he would not, he was angry, and he threw chairs, and he broke windows, and he ran outside in his pajamas. And then the Americans put him on an aircraft and flew him back to the United States, again secretly, and put him in a psychiatric hospital at Eglin Air Force Base in the Florida Panhandle, where they pumped him full of Thorazine again, and then started to give him months of electroshock. And then they threw him out of the Air Force.
There is one point in the book, though, that I missed a little bit here. What was the official reason for this discharge? I tried to find it, but I couldn't quite see what reason the military actually gave for the electroshock and the psych hold.
Well, the reason you missed it is because there was no reason given for his dismissal, his incarceration in a psychiatric institution. There was no reason that would justify that kind of treatment. They simply, in his military service record, which I got through the Freedom of Information Act, including his psychiatric treatment records, there was never a reason given by the Air Force that would justify what they did to him. So one can only surmise what were the unstated reasons for this. And my reporting with Army intelligence people who helped me to sort of guess what happened, it's almost certain that what happened to Nichols was that he became someone that the Air Force Higher Command no longer trusted. The CIA was operating in Korea at the time. The State Department's influence through the embassy was increasingly strong. And it seems that Nichols was simply not trusted anymore to represent American interests. So they decided to destroy him, I surmise, by discrediting him with psychiatric treatment. It's very clear he was not a severely schizophrenic person, which is what the doctors diagnosed him as. His symptoms, his general professional performance show that he was not schizophrenic. He was not schizophrenic before they put him in the straitjacket, and he was not schizophrenic in the 60s after he got out of the psychiatric institution. But that was his diagnosis, and I think it was a cover-up so they could get rid of Nichols and get him out of there without embarrassment to the U.S. government.
So we might drill down a bit more into the North Korean state here with your first book, Escape from Camp 14, and the life story of Shin Dong-hyuk, the only person to have been born in a North Korean gulag and escaped to the West. So you're in South Korea as a journalist, and you're in Hanwon, this complex where all the defectors are, and you bump into this extraordinary person.
Well, I was in Hanwon, but I didn't meet Shin in Hanwon. I met Shin. Shin, when I met him, he had been in South Korea for a couple years. His story was well known. It had been in all of the South Korean newspapers. It had been in the International Herald Tribune, in the Chicago newspapers, and he was a known quantity as a defector. At my situation at that time, I was searching for ways to explain what the texture of life was like in North Korea. So I sort of had been told by my bosses to take the time and interview defectors. You're living in Seoul, I assume.
Yes.
Defectors are a very jumpy bunch of people. They're distrustful. They're afraid. They're disoriented.
Yes, at one point you say they're all clinically paranoid.
Well, that's what the psychiatrists at Hanwon told me, that's a pretty fair description, and they say it's probably a useful adaptation to life in North Korea. So in any case, I was sort of systematically trying to talk to various people. I talked to fishermen, I talked to farmers, and then I met Shin. And I knew that his story had been publicized, but I just wrote a regular newspaper story about him that ran on the front page of the Washington Post, and it garnered this incredible reaction from readers, much more than anything else I'd written about North Korea. So I went back to him and I said, "Look, if you'll tell me a lot more about your life, I'd like to write a book about you." And so he said no, and refused to cooperate for about 6 months to a year. But during that time, he'd moved to the United States to work as a sort of ambassador for Liberty in North Korea, which is a California-based human rights group regarding North Korea, particularly the camps and defectors who moved through China. So with Link's help, I managed to get Shin to agree to work on the book, which we did for another 2 years. And he's a very difficult person to interview, distrustful, evasive, contradictory, but also incredibly intelligent and sensitive and articulate. A most impressive and troubled and difficult man, I must say. So over the course of the next 2 years, I did these series of interviews with him, and during which he changed his story, lied to me, but he also told a story that was pretty consistent with what he'd said before, and it was supported by other defectors who said that no one could have the affect and the knowledge that he has of the inner working of the camps unless he'd been there. So I wrote the book. It came out in 2012. I wrote the book thinking that this would just be something that I should do because I'd finished in my career for the Washington Post and I was moving on, hopefully, to write more books. And I thought that this would just be something that would be a valuable contribution to the literature on a story that was well known about Shin. But then the book took off. It sold a lot, surprising me and surprising Shin. And it became a sort of cause célèbre, a reason, not this only reason, but a principal reason for the UN to push North Korea for crimes against humanity.
On that point, a lot of your book and some of the work of David Hawke's work of human rights, HRNK, his book's called, or his report's called Hidden Gulag. There
Yes.
were huge pushes behind the UN Commission of Inquiry, and then those findings were sent to the UN Security Council and the International Criminal Court.
Right.
And I'd wonder what you think of the North Korean gulags, because it sort of gets lost in all the talk of nuclear weapons and missile launches and Olympic Games. You tend to miss what the real tragedy of North Korea is.
Well, that's true. The fact is that the camps remain. They're still operating. The phone that you've got in your pocket shows you the fences around these camps, which continue to operate. There are now 4 or 5 of them, including Camp 14. There's been new construction in some of them. There's clearly new people who've been sent to these camps since Kim Jong-un came to power. And what's also interesting, according to HRNK and David Hawk, is that North Korea is no longer allowing people to come out of the camps. The reason that I was able to interview, I think I interviewed about 10 other camp survivors besides Shin, was because they went to other camps and then would be released after 5 or 10 years, and then some of them would defect, find their way out of North Korea and find their way to South Korea, and so that's David Hawk talked to virtually all of those people.
So is that only the total control zones that are not releasing people, or is that the whole
all of
gulag
the
system?
camps, all of the political prison camps have stopped releasing people, or at least people from those camps are no longer finding their way to China and around through Southeast Asia into Korea. Now it's possible that some may have come in recent months, because I haven't checked, but as of the last year, the flow of people out of the political prison camps back into the general society in North Korea and then defecting, it's virtually stopped. And part of that reason is that Kim Jong-un has made it much more difficult to go to China if you're crossing the border illegally. The flow of defectors into South Korea has dramatically slowed since he came to power.
So on that last point, I imagine that this was the more difficult book to research of the lot, simply because of how you get information.
Well, it was. That was the thing that drove me crazy about working on that book, and then subsequently after Shin changed his story. Now, when I first wrote the book, I said, I can't check the things that Shin has told me. And I also wrote that Shin lied to me and changed his story. And no reporter wants to be in the position of having one source for a story. But in the case of Shin and Camp 14, that's what I had. And I tried to, I talked to other defectors from other camps, but they hadn't been in that camp.
Did you also speak to some former prison guards as well?
Yes, and prison guards as well, who knew Shin and knew that he could not be he could not have known the things that he knew unless he had been in such a situation. And in any case, as you know, and as many people know, Shin did lie to me, and that part of what he told me for the book was not true.
Well, we might drill down on that a little bit if you like. He lied to you before the book was published, and then you discovered another lie after it was published. And then there was a strange episode when Shin believed his father had died simply as retaliation for Shin escaping. And then the North Koreans put him in front of a camera and got him to effectively denounce his son. Does that get you just to answer some of those thoughts?
Right. And so Shin was, as I said, he did not think that the book would become a big deal, but it did. It became a very big deal, and he became a rather famous young man because of it, and because of the focus from the United Nations inquiry into crimes against humanity in North Korea. So when the North Koreans put his father on television, Shin had to sort of reassess the story that he'd told. Also, other people from the area around Camp 14 Camp 14's borders had sort of switched over the years. And some of the people who lived in that part of North Korea, they found their way to Seoul, and they said that Shin did not live his whole life in Camp 14. So he then told one of the prison guards, who'd been one of my original sources, that he had lied to me about some aspects of his life. And then I found out that Shin had said that, and I rushed to Seoul in December of 2015, and I sat with Shin for a couple more weeks going over this, and finally he was more forthcoming. He seemed to have dropped another layer of self-protection, and he told me a slightly modified story of his life, which I thought was, as time goes by, the differences between the first two versions seem less significant to me. And the reasons for that is, Shin, his body is covered with scars of the kind that you cannot inflict upon yourself by having an imagination. He was tortured, and probably more thoroughly than any known person coming out of North Korea in the past couple decades. That's according to prison guards who know him and have seen the scars on his body. Yeah. So he really did suffer mightily in the camp. The other thing that I learned that I did not have as great of appreciation of when I did the book was the degree to which torture for an adolescent causes them to have very selective memories and a real inability to tell the kind of clear chronological truth that judges and juries and prosecutors and journalists like to hear. He tells
so do you think that's a mental scarring of sorts, or a PTSD sort of system?
He tells a story that he can bear to tell. And that's what he told me, although as time went by, he did disclose more and more about the depraved young man that he became in the camp. He betrayed his mother and brother and was responsible for their death. He told me that, and the circumstances were slightly different in the second version of that story. But still, he felt that he was one of the poisoned people of North Korea who would sell anybody out for a sandwich, basically. And he hated himself for that. He also hated himself for breaking under torture in Camp 14. And the amount of suffering and memory scarring that he still has, was not appreciated by me until I went through this sort of second round with him. And so I started interviewing him in 2008. And, I'm still in touch with him, but then I did another big round of interviews in 2015, and I continued to learn more about him as he has learned more about what he is willing to tell himself about how he grew up. He's a fascinating and troubled guy. But I think one thing that your listeners should know is that, his life is really quite sweet now compared to what it was even 2 years ago. He's married a Korean American woman who's a lovely person, and he has a son and a baby boy, and he's really quite happy compared to the tormented young man I met.
Yes, I was actually going to ask about that, because he's living back in South Korea, I believe, after struggling for a little bit. But most at least throughout longitudinal studies, most people that do suffer like this live quite troubled lives for a long period of time. And Shin himself, like you said, one of the most important things about your book, I think, is that he is a very real person. So he's not a perfect hero. There's no real such thing as righteous victims. And he has problems in the camp. He betrays his mother and his brother and gets them killed. At times he says he hated his mother. He stole food from her. It's a real troubled situation. And then he finds himself outside of North Korea and still struggling with the guilt and the empathy, and he's struggling to adjust to a different type of New World morality. At one point you say he feels like he's pretending all the time.
Yeah, he does. And he said to me so many times that he wasn't worthy to get married and to have love and to have children. That because he had betrayed friends, he had betrayed his family to survive in the camp. He just felt like he was an animal. He used that word again and again to describe himself, and slowly he's come to the idea that he is a human being, and that he is worthy of love and of giving it and receiving it. And that's been pretty wonderful to see. But it's not been an easy transition, and it's not nearly over. I mean, as you say, the history of camp survivors from places like Auschwitz and other Nazi concentration camps, those people generally, longitudinal studies shows that their lives never really turned out to be good because they were too poisoned. And in Shin's case, getting that poison out of his system is something that will never happen, I don't think. And I believe that he would say that too.
Okay. Well, I might move on to some broader issues just to finish things off here.
Yeah.
You were also a contributor to the PBS Frontline documentary, North Korea's Deadly Dictator.
Yeah.
So I might ask you about Kim Jong-un. At points in your second two books, you mentioned about in your final book, you mention about Kim Jong-un, and you talk about how he dresses, his style, his haircut, maybe even plastic surgery, and even his wife. How they look and resemble the first great leader, Kim Il-sung.
Right. Well, Kim Il-sung had the sort of pixie dust magic of any great demagogue. He could lead his people into a destructive war that destroyed the country and still have their support when he rebuilt it over the next 20, 30 years. He was a gifted politician of a kind that comes along, once a century. In one of the books I wrote, I said that measured by the persistence of his regime, that Kim Il-sung could be described as perhaps the most successful leader of the 20th century, in the sense that the state that he built continues to exist very much as he designed it. In a sense, he has succeeded in stopping time itself. And I say all this in relation to his grandson, Kim Jong-un, because Kim Jong-un seems to be savvy enough to understand the greatness, the demagogic genius of his grandfather, and want to emulate it as much as he can. So he affects a look that is somewhat similar to his grandfather, and a style of public meetings and shaking hands and slapping backs and being a man of the people, while at the same time he has some of the ferocity, killing his uncle and apparently assassinating his half brother. It's as if Kim Il-sung is present in the look and behavior of his grandson.
Yeah, so that ruthless side in killing Jang Song-taek and Kim Jong-nam is quite present, but there's also a side which might indicate he isn't quite on the ball as much as people may think. It's hard to really pass how he came about to bring Dennis Rodman to the country on 3 separate occasions.
Yeah, I don't understand that. People say it's because he was interested in basketball when he was an adolescent and going to boarding school in Switzerland. It may be. I don't pretend to understand why he would want to hang out with Rodman, or why Rodman would do it himself. It's a curiosity.
Sure. And on the final point here, what do you make of the Olympic diplomacy that's happening at the moment? I mean, if you went back 6 months, it'd be very hard to guess that as all the missiles and nuclear tests were going off, that all it might take is a few singers, a few athletes, and his sister to arrive in South Korea, and the perception of him in most of the foreign media would change quite dramatically.
Yeah, it is surprising that the perception changed so quickly. But the game that North Korea has played with the South is one of embracing and then slapping. When I was in reporting in South Korea, there was a visit, a state visit, and there was also the shelling, the sinking of the naval ship, the South Korean naval ship. So these things they go in cycles, but what doesn't change is the interest of the Kim family in preserving itself, its power, and its privileges over time. And Kim Jong-un has been quite successful in keeping his state alive, keeping his power intact. And because of the technology, the nukes and the long-range missiles, he has a more robust state now than his grandfather had. But it still seems to me that he's in the business of preserving power and not going to war against somebody else. So
you see it as quite a rational regime then?
It's a rational state devoted to its own preservation. The one time that North Korea went on the offensive against South Korea and against the United States and against the rest of the world, the country ceased to exist for all intents and purposes and was only revivified because of Mao. And the leadership in China is not going to do the same favor for Kim Jong-un.
Okay. So just to finish off here, I take it that you started writing your first book, Camp 14, simply by a chance meeting with Shin. And then after that, the Great Leader and the Fighter Pilot came about when No contacted you, or Kenneth Rowe contacted you. Yeah. And then you bumped into Nicholls during writing that book. So is there a fourth North Korean book on the way?
No, there's not.
No? Is that by choice or by sheer luck?
Well, I've sort of run out of energy on this subject. I'm not quite sure what's next.
Sure. Well, thanks for being on the Korea Now podcast, Blaine Harden. You can be contacted at www.blaineharden.com, and you're on Twitter, I believe, as well.
That's right.
Okay, it's been a pleasure, Blaine Harden. Thanks a lot.
Thank you. Bye-bye.